Good evening and welcome. My name is Annette Stransky. I'm the president of the Saratoga Historical Foundation. Before we start, please turn off your mic and video camera because we are recording the presentation. If you have any questions, use chat at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Next slide. The mission of the Saratoga Historical Foundation is to preserve the rich history of Saratoga for the education and enjoyment of the community. We provide exhibits, lectures, scholarship, and essay contests, as well as pioneer living classes for young people, as well as an 8-page newsletter. Visit us at 20450 Saratoga Las Gatas Road and see the museum in a 1904 building. An 1850 pioneer cottage, fully furnished, is also available, and a one-room schoolhouse, and soon a blacksmith exhibit. We are open Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from 1 to 4. Our current exhibit is called Riding the Rails on the Interurban, as well as we also have a special exhibit on grandparents. Our next lecture will be November 12th. At 1 p.m. with historian Ray Cousin, Remembering the Flying Tigers. If you'd like to attend, please contact the Saratoga Rotary at info@saratogarotary.org for more information. On November 17th at 7 p.m. on Zoom, historian Ray Cousin will have a presentation on Riding the Rails, the Interurban Rail. We hope you'll join us. If you want more information about our events, go up to www.saratogahistory.com. All lectures in this series are recorded and posted on www.saratogahistory.com. On November 26th, we have an open house, and we hope you'll join us with light music, refreshments, as well as, again, your ability to see our new exhibit called the Special Events of History. Next slide, please. Our speaker, Joe Page, has a bachelor's degree in engineering from New Mexico State University, bachelor's in history and English, and is a grad student in history at the University of New Mexico. He served as an Air Force Base missile officer 15 years, was a Minuteman, 3rd Missile Combat Crew, and Space Control Operator. He currently works at Plans and Policy Analyst for Department of Air Force. He is the author of books on Holloman, Vandenberg, Kirtland, Ellsworth, and Onizuka Air Force Base. Here's Joe.
Thank you, Annette, and thank you, Thomas. Thank you to the Saratoga Historical Society for inviting me. Thank you for allowing me to present this historical context coverage of Onizuka Air Force Base. As you can see from the title where it says Nexus of the Space Race, I've had lively debates with folks who've done NASA histories, civil space histories, and sometimes we get into these discussions or lively debates to say what actually was the nexus of the space race from the beginning. When I wrote my master's thesis back in 2005, I took an interesting approach when I talked about the space race because I talked about the civil space race, launching Mercury, Gemini, Apollo astronauts into space. I talked about the satellites that NASA launched to help with Earth observation analysis. And then there was that third space race, which was the National Reconnaissance Office, CIA, and the US Air Force launching reconnaissance satellites into orbit. At the time, 2005, there was only a little bit that was actually declassified. The Corona program was declassified in 1995. There was bits and pieces from what the Satellite Control Network had done. So over the intervening years, I've collected more and more information. I wish I could show you my table right now. It's just stacked up with requests and documents from the National Reconnaissance Office. So anyway, my posit is that Onizuka was critical as a nexus to the space race. Next slide, please. This is what I'm going to cover. I tried to keep the words simple on the slides, so it allows me to actually talk and not just read slides. That is boring as heck. I'm going to talk a bit more about my introduction and why I see things the way I do. I'm going to talk about the historical context of Sunnyvale, Onizuka Air Force Station. I'm going to talk about the legacy of the people, the name, and the work that was done in Sunnyvale. And then I'll have some questions at the end. I'm sorry, you guys will have questions for me at the end, hopefully. Next slide. All right, so who am I? Thank you, Annette, for the great introduction. That covered my academic history, if you will. I love history. I've loved it since I was a kid, but I realized that more cases than not had to have usually another degree to make a living at. So I got an engineering degree first, but history has always been my avocation. As I'll show on the next slide, you'll see how far back my history love has come from space history and Air Force history. I was a former space and missile officer, first toward Minuteman, the rest toward space control assignments, did 15 years and then got out in 2015. And all throughout my career, I was basically part-time historian, either part-time historian for the squadron, or when I got out, I started writing books. I will make this clear for the recording. I have no association with any three-letter agencies. I've not worked for any, don't plan on working for any right now. I think the closest I have to a three-letter organization that I've worked with or for was Boy Scouts of America. All of my research for this book and stuff that I have sitting on my desk here that you can't see was conducted through legitimate means. What I mean by that is there were no WikiLeaks. There were no people running to me in the dark of night saying, hey, I got some great stuff. I did FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, MDR, Mandatory Declassification Review requests. Everything that I've used here, and some of the slides have the sources on the bottom, they were either provided to me through the mail. An example of one document. Hexagon report, 1201. First guy to get a copy of this, since it was actually published, I guess. First one on the outside, I guess, to see the document. But that's how I do my research. There are reasons why some of these slides are worded the way they are. Can you go back 2 slides? 3, 4. Okay. There may be reasons why I'm wording things on the slides the way they are, so please don't slam me too much in the questions at the end. Some of them are due to ignorance, some of them are due not to ignorance, but again, if it's not declassified and not out on the NRO's website, then I can't talk about it. Next slide, please. So the book, Onizuka Air Force Base Images of America book for Arcadia Publishing, that was a gift to my father. Worked at Sunnyvale Air Force Station. We were actually there in California when Challenger had exploded. My dad's kind of sketchy on the details, what happened on shift that day. I would love to hear more from anyone. I'll just throw that out there. And we left in 1988 to other places. Other places here in New Mexico. Leave a hint there. I am, as I said, I'm a historian by avocation, engineer by training and education. Technical details, I love beeps and squeaks. I love computer programming. I love hearing all the orbital details, love it all. I actually have a hexagon engineering test report. It's about 2 inches thick. Lots of computer code in there. Now that's all great and wonderful. And I'm sure most of you guys and gals in the chat are looking for those details. But one of the key things I see is context about why the beeps and squeaks are important, the larger overview. So that's where my presentation today is going to go. We're going to go at about 35,000 foot level. We're going to be going probably about 500 miles an hour. So I ask you to sit back and enjoy the ride, but understand that there is a lot of history at that site. A lot of people have worked there, a lot of organizations. I cannot cover everything. And I will do a shout out real quick. How you doing, Dick? I see Dick Morris right there. We've been chatting in the past, so just want to say hi to him. I can't make everyone happy, so please understand that. Hit me with critiques later on, but that's how I see things. And that picture at the bottom is me in 1985. I'm the guy on the left, and it's my sister and a family friend. We were in the Moffett Naval Air Station housing. My dad was going to work at the Blue Cube. Next slide. All right. One of the complaints I hear most often about the book is the name, Onizuka Air Force Base. I'm going to cover this at the end also, but Arcadia, I had written 4 or 5 books before there. They love Air Force bases. They love the term Air Force Base because people can relate, they can understand, they know. Air Force stations, not so much. Most of the Air Force stations were minor sites. So just take the, that came from an editor. When I named the book Onizuka Air Force Base, it was for marketing reasons only. Okay, I understand as I hear names, and more names. When the facility was originally being planned for, it was called the Sentry Development Control Center, because at the time, the program it was going to control was called Sentry. In 1958, 59-ish, it was named the Satellite Test Center, STIC. That's what the Air Force knew it as for the longest time. Actually, no, not for the longest time. I'll get to that in slides. It was renamed the Satellite Test Annex in 1960. Then a couple years down the line, 1971, we have Sunnyvale Air Force Station. The Air Force now acknowledges that operations are going on in the 1970s. A lot of stuff is building up, a lot of stuff being launched. And then in 1986, after the destruction calendar and the death of Colonel Onizuka and his fellow astronauts, it was renamed Onizuka Air Force Station. For a brief time, it was renamed Air Force Base. Then it bounced back to Air Station and then Air Force Station, which most of the folks know as when it was closed down. Again, please don't slime me too much on the title of the book, but it was based on all these changes and marketing and sales. Next slide. All right, got to start with the why. Every good historian starts with why. Now, because I'm a nuke guy, everything starts with Trinity. People would definitely disagree with me there. So we designed the atomic bomb, we test it here in New Mexico, 1945, and then we drop it twice in combat over Japan, and it's World War II. You know, Manhattan Project had spies. So the spies basically took back information to the Soviets and helped them develop their own atomic weapon. So the post-World War II threat in the Soviet Union, those atomic weapons were large and cumbersome. If anyone's ever seen a Fat Man bomb, that is a big bomb. It takes a heavy bomber, B-29, to lift it and drop it. So those weapons were large and cumbersome, and they required delivery by aircraft. Missiles were in its infancy, V-2s and a couple other programs that were coming after World War II, but nothing major. So the way to prevent a nuclear Pearl Harbor, surprise attack with nuclear weapons, U.S. creates the distant early warning line. So there's a line of radar stations in Canada and the U.S. Detecting if aircraft are coming over the poles to drop atomic weapons. So we have warning. We have warning of a few hours, sometimes days, if we can tell the aircraft are moving. Now, when thermonuclear weapons are developed, bigger boom, really big boom. But they're also compact. Compared to what taking a B-29 to drop a thermonuclear weapon, you could put it on the top of an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile. You could launch that sucker almost anywhere in the world within 30 minutes or less. Now, back then it took a couple hours to fuel them, took a lot of minutes to get them prepped, and then actually the launch time took a few minutes. So now we have a problem because these weapons can be launched and get to the target within a very short amount of time. How can we see what these rockets are doing, what the adversary is doing, and how can we be ready? So satellites were the answer. We could provide, if we had satellites in orbit, we could provide that warning and get it down to hours or minutes. Now, President Eisenhower at the time, he knew his training and experience in World War II and knowing that intelligence was the key to most, if not all operations, he had this desire to know what are the Russians doing. Now, since that spaceflight technology was still in its infancy, the best way to go at the time was develop aerial reconnaissance. The U-2 spy plane, picture on the bottom, could fly very high, relatively slow, I guess, compared to other aircraft. It would fly over and take pictures of denied territory. Now, in 1961, U-2 was shot down. Francis Gary Powers held captive by the Russians, and the U.S. kind of ended up with egg on their face that they were actually flying a spy plane and taking photos. Now, these photo satellites, Corona, and a few others, were in development prior to that shoot down. Those were kept in the classified world, along with the U-2, but once you shoot down a U-2 and it comes crashing down to Earth, really can't hide that. So those photo satellites were in development, and GRAB, which is the first electronic intelligence satellite, they were already in the works. Because Eisenhower, knowing his experience in combat, something's going to happen, and I need to switch over to a different technology or a different way to pick up information. Next slide. So the Air Force wanted to get, I guess, ahead of the game here, realizing the need and the desire to put a satellite into orbit to do that early warning, created the Western Development Division. This was out in Inglewood, California, and it was a subsection of the Air Research and Development Command. It was later renamed the Ballistic Missile Division. So location basically kept the same. The name kind of changed as the work increased and the span scope of operations. Also, picture there is General Bernard Schriever. He is considered the father of U.S. Air Force Space and missiles. Amazing guy. I'm working on a project right now on his background, and I am floored every time I pick up his biography. And knowing what he did back in World War II and helped get the Air Force where they needed to be for the space race. The model rockets surrounding him are all the projects he worked on in the mid 1950s to the early 1960s. Now, some of those are Thor's, Atlas, Minuteman, Titan. A few of the ones in front are NASA projects. There's a Thor Agena. Every one of these programs either helped bolster the missile delivery part, because we were going to be ready to strike nuclear warhead against our adversary, or, as you can see over his left shoulder, the little rockets there with the little rounded tips. That's what I'm thinking of. He made the ability of changing those Thor IRBM rockets over to satellite boosters. So now we have satellites and we want to launch them into space, and he got the job done. First project was Weapon System 117L. It was supposed to encompass, actually we're going to cover that in the next slide, so I'll just hang on first, grabbing too much of that. So Weapon System 117L, contracts were handed out in 1955, 56 to Lockheed. So this was even before Sputnik was launched. So as much as the Russians did get ahead of us in the space race, it's not due to lack of trying. We were trying to get it right. We were trying to do a lot of things, ballistic missile launches, satellite launches, all over, running the gamut. The Russians just happened to build a larger rocket and got their satellite up there first. Next slide. All right, WS-117L, amazing program. I'm going to show this real quick. As a good researcher, I always give credit to other writers. I Am the Red Storm. This is a great history of WS-117L. The sad fact is the program was sliced and diced basically because it was an Air Force program and Lockheed had the contract. It was basically known to the world. It was acknowledged. So when Eisenhower wanted to get that satellite up into space, they basically sliced and diced bits and pieces of the WS-117L, and some things were canceled and some things were canceled. The three payloads that were originally planned were a visual one, Samos and Corona. Corona would have been a film-based one. That also went by the code name or cover story of Discoverer. Samos was supposed to be an electronic readout. It's basically, this is really strange, and I'm sure most of the folks on the line here would at least know what this is. Take a picture of it, run the film basically through a fax machine, and then beam that down to a ground station. I had to try to describe what a fax machine was to my kids, and it was an utter failure. Why can't you just use email? Why a fax machine? Anyway, the second of three payloads was a ferret, which would now be called signals intelligence. So communications intelligence or electronic intelligence, but back then they called it ferret. And that became what would be later be known as the EarPop series. Pictures of that was declassified by the NRO probably about 2 or 3 years ago. So there's a lot of them on the web, and I have a stack of color photos right here. And the last one was infrared. Because we knew the Soviets had rockets and they could get something into space, they could definitely launch a warhead to the US homeland. So we wanted to know whether those rockets, when they were being launched. So an infrared payload in orbit would allow us to see that. So these were the three payloads that were under WS-117. The contract, as I said before, was won by Lockheed Missile Systems Division. I was looking for when it would change over to the Lockheed Missiles and Space Division, but I couldn't find it. I'm sure somebody on the line knows and will tell me. So WS-117L had a lot of subsystems, A through J. And the ones I included here were relevant to the story of, we'll call it the stick right now, and then we'll go through the name changes. Subsystems A, B, C, and D basically dealt with the Agena upper state. those 4 subsystems would all be compact in the Agena. So it was a bus to hold the payload. It was attitude control system to actually orient it on orbit. And I don't have to list the rest of them, but all those things were encompassed in Agena. Subsystem E was the film reconnaissance. I listed under Corona because Corona didn't exist at the time yet until WS-117L was canceled, but it was the film taking photographs from space. Subsystem F would have been SIGINT payloads, which then broke off to the EarPop series. And why we're here today, Subsystem H, Satellite Control Network, or as the actual documentation says, Space to Ground Network. They planned ahead that these rockets, satellites were going to go into orbit. They would take pictures or pick up intelligence from wherever in the world to deliver that intelligence. The Satellite Control Network would have to be in charge of timing, sending commands to the satellite, receiving the payloads, whether electronically or the film buckets coming back. And they had to plan for that, also being worldwide. And if you notice, if you look at a map, the Soviet Union takes up a wide chunk of the world, so all of the stations at the time had to be spaced in US territory. And then data processing and recovery. Data processing would be the processing on the ground, actually recording to the tapes and sending commands, getting everything recorded, and keeping a nice tape library. And subsystem L was recovery. Next slide, please. All right, Sunnyvale and Lockheed. I got some notes on this, so I don't want to mess this up. I always ask the question, why was Lockheed in Sunnyvale? What was the draw? Because I saw pictures when I talked to the Sunnyvale Historical Society, and it was mostly agricultural fields. What brought them to the area? And I found out that the Stanford provost, Frederick Terman, started luring companies to Palo Alto in the 1950s. He wanted to offer land to the companies, and the benefit for him and the students were employment, ready access to graduates and research. So the companies would receive the benefit of having really smart folks working for them. And then Stanford can pump out these folks and say, you have some good employment here in the Bay Area. Stanford leased some office space to Lockheed Missile Systems Division in Stanford Research Park. They quickly ran out of space. So they ended up purchasing about 275 acres outside of Moffett Field. And that is Plant 1 on the left and the right-hand side pictures. I got them at different times. The left side is 1968, and the right side, I'm not sure when the timing was. They did keep that space in Stanford Research Park, and they leased it for a little bit longer, and that came into play during the first Corona launch, but I'll get to that in a few minutes. So Lockheed Missile Systems Division had 600 people, 350 moving vans moving up from Southern California over Labor Day weekend in 1956. So a huge caravan of trucks and people coming up to the Bay Area. About 2,000 coworkers came in the following weeks. One of the quotes was, the Sunnyvale site was all bean fields then, and Bayshore Freeway was only a 2-lane road. See that down at the bottom there. It's just amazing. I've been back to Sunnyvale since the 80s more than a handful of times, and I'm just amazed every time it gets bigger and bigger. I think you guys are probably maxed out the space now, but seeing these pictures just amazes me. And Lockheed ruled the roost of the area. In 1960, the population of Sunnyvale was around 53,000 people, and Lockheed employees numbered around 20,000. So almost half the population of Sunnyvale. Next slide. All right, Agena. Got to talk about Agena. Agena makes the day here. When I said before that Lockheed won the WS-117L contract and the Agena vehicle, they built the Agenas at Plant 1. Agena was considered the first multi-purpose satellite. Most people know it as basically an upper stage. You have a rocket, IRBM or ICBM rocket body, and then you have Agena right on the top. I have a picture of it coming up soon. And the Agena was a 3-axis stabilized spacecraft. So once the payload was up in orbit, it didn't rotate. I don't know if you've seen old space photos or space probes going out to the outer planets. The satellites actually rotate. Well, these were 3-axis stabilized. The first couple models, first pair, A and B, basically it was the minimum the contract asked for. The A could get the satellite up there, could do the axis stabilization, could do the command and controlling, and it had a little bit of boost time afterwards to reorient itself in orbit. And the batteries had a limited lifespan. The B models of the Agena kind of boosted that a little bit, gave it a little bit more time, a little bit more impulse on orbit to actually reorient the satellite. But the A and B were limited, and they were also built around the payloads. As I mentioned before, the Corona and the Earpop series, they and many, many others that NASA built, they had the payload, and then they built the Agena around it, where they tried to fit it into the Agena as best as possible. When we get to the D model Agena, called the standardized Agena. So basically, the Agena upper stage was standardized, and everything tried to fit inside that. I'm going for simplistics here. I know I have a couple satellite engineers on the line, and I'm sure they're going to correct me. So, standardized Agena was the largest block number, or the largest number of Agenas built. I have a great history that I may be the only person who has it. It's the Agena history from Lockheed. This was actually published in 1987, so it was at the closeout of the Agena program. But up to that point, they had 362 launches. So 1959 to 1987, with an overall success rate of greater than 90%. That's just amazing. Had 25 different missions over 14 different programs. Those programs were classified programs, all the way through civil programs for NASA, and a couple interplanetary missions also. So this system, having the WS-117L contract, gave Lockheed that experience that they needed to become the experts. They were the first to develop this standardized assembly line to build these upper stages / satellites, and they gained experience through a lot of failures and even more success. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, Plant 1, Lockheed Martin, I'm sorry, I slipped there. Lockheed Missiles and Space Division had that manufacturing expertise, had Plant 1 is where they built the satellites. They need a place to control it. Where else to keep it but someplace close? They already had that land in Palo Alto, leads from Stanford. So the first Discoverer launch, which was a Corona bird, but they just call it Discoverer 1 for its cover story, was run out of an interim control center in Palo Alto. Had some problems with that in the first 12 launches ever. I'm missing the date here because I don't have the list with me, but the temporary control center, basically where building 1001, can you go back, please? Building 1001, it was opened up in, I'm sorry, temporary control center while building 1001 was being built was opened in March 1960. So they moved away from Palo Alto, went onto that Lockheed land, and then ran a few of the Discoverer missions. And then the satellite test center, the STIC, was activated in June 1960. Please. All right, the 6594th Aerospace Test Wing. The first 1 or 2 launches of Discoverer was under Lockheed's guise, but the Air Force was there guiding it. Then in 1960, they stood up the 65th 94th Aerospace Test Wing. The logo on top, the eagle swooping around the Earth. Their motto underneath there, I won't even try because I'll probably hack up the Latin, was "We shall either find a way or make one." This was attributed to Hannibal back during the days of the Punic War, when he told his generals, "We're going to make it through the Alps. You're either going to find a way or we're going to make one." The test wing, and we have an organizational chart in the next one, had a lot of responsibilities. Not only did it control the satellites in orbit, hold the timing, commanding to kick out the payloads, it had to guide recovery forces over the Pacific Ocean. We want to make sure our adversary did not grab the payloads when they came out. So we had recovery forces in Hawaii. And then, as mentioned before, as one of the subsystems of WX-117L, there was a worldwide tracking network. I put quotes on that because at the time it was only a few stations. It was not really worldwide. And command and control was done with the STIC. Now, this was the first organization that was dedicated to space operations from launch to recovery. There's actually one of the ground stations that was based near Vandenberg Air Force Base. At the time, it was Cook Air Force Base, and then switched over in 1958. They could test payloads that they were sending out, send those beeps and squeaks right to the launch pad because the Vandenberg tracking station was on a hill and the launch pads were down near the ocean. So the stick had control of everything basically from cradle to grave. Next slide, please. I just threw some pictures up here. This is the building 1001, and you can see some of the date and timing there. It still says Air Force Ballistic Missile Division and then Air Research Development Command. The word aerospace was dropped off the test wing. The unit would go through many name changes throughout the years, but again, it's a whole naming thing of how do you say what you're talking about and where you're talking about. Down below, that is the Master Control Center in Building 1001. It's a great picture. Most of the archival photos I found were black and white. I'm glad to see an actual color photo existed. Those control consoles had ashtrays built in. It's one of those things back in the day that I guess they assumed everyone smoked, so they had them available. I saw those in some launch sites that were of the era. It was just weird to see a control console and an ashtray that you could stick your cigarette in. Probably makes me cringe nowadays. Off to the right-hand side, it is a picture of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Moose Matheson. He is a very lively and colorful figure in the early history of the stick and the Corona program. I didn't want to go over too many of the stories here, but there a lot of the photos of the first payload recovered on Discoverer 13 has Colonel Matheson in the photo. So I know he was there because he was working with the stick in command, but it's just really strange to see this guy in like every photo. I don't think it was photo bombing. I think he actually had to be at these meetings when the president was presented with the flag and all that, but it's kind of funny to see. He died a few years ago here in Albuquerque. I really wish I had known at the time before his death, because I would have questions. Next slide, please. Here's that worldwide satellite control network that I mentioned. Org charts, really hate org charts on most things, but I really had to show this. Some of these satellite control stations were only open up for a brief time, first couple launches. They found out it just didn't work or they just didn't need it anymore. So there's a few of them that has the X's through them. Let's see what we got. Top line, 6594th Instrumentation Squadron, Grenadier Field, Massachusetts. It's actually what would now be called New Boston Air Force Station, Space Force Station. They renamed it a few months ago. That is the picture down in the middle. See that dish sitting in the middle of an almost forest and a road cut through it? That is New Boston. Off to the right-hand side of that org chart, the 6594th Recovery Control Group. They ran, Hawaii was kind of special. It had the recovery control section to guide those C-119 aircraft underneath. You see it catching a parachute. And at Cana Point, they actually had a tracking station. But that was the last tracking station that would hit the satellite with a command saying, drop your payload. So they had to keep it close that on the next revolution, the satellite would have received the command and then say, tick, 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 there's so many seconds, so many minutes, and then drop the payload, and then it would come into the drop over the ocean. The 6596th Instrumentation Squadron is on the left-hand side there. Vandenberg Tracking Station is by the call sign Cook, is of Cook Air Force Base at the time. Now, this worldwide satellite control network was small in the beginning, and then as time went on, and they realized they needed better ability to control the satellites or send commands to the satellites for various reasons, the network was expanded. The two stations there, Kodiak and Annette Island, they were used for the first few years for Annette, and then Kodiak lasted, I think, until the early 70s. And then they were just deemed problematic, either getting the commands to or lines, communication lines from. They found better ways to utilize the network that they closed the station down. The book will actually have a chapter with all of those stations, a couple photos, really happy snaps of people and the stuff that went on there. I won't go too much into this presentation, but next slide, please. Corona program. I will tell you right now, I'm going to do a disservice to Corona, Gambit, Hexagon, and a few of the other ones just based on time. I can't cover everything. I've got thousands of pages of documentation. It is a great program to research. I encourage anyone to do that. Started with the discover recover story. The Air Force had already had bits and pieces of WX-117 known to the world, and then they came over to the discover recover story of we're going to try biomedical payloads in space. We're going to launch monkeys and mice. Primates were actually listed on there. It's really weird. But they're going to send mice into orbit, a couple other tests for biomedical reasons, and then bring the payloads back down in a capsule. And as you can see on the right, the photo on top, that was not the case. The camera actually sat in there and had a recovery vehicle that would collect the film. This is one of the later Corona satellites. You can tell because it has 2 film capsules. Early Corona launches only had 1. 144 satellites were launched from 1959 to 1972. The history will say 145 satellites. There was actually 1 that did something completely different and special, and I'm not going to cover it here. The first few missions of Corona had film that returned 40-foot resolution. Now, I am not a photo interpreter guy, but the bits and pieces that I picked up, ground resolved resolution, I'm using the wrong acronym here. Basically says you have to have something that is at least 40 foot or 40 feet spaced apart to be able to distinguish 2. So if you had a runway that was over 40 foot across next to a second runway with at least a 40-foot distance, you could tell that it was 2 separate runways or buildings for that matter. If they were any closer than that, then you just see 1 big blob. That resolution would be lowered down to 5 feet. 5 or 6 feet. I have differing reference. So that's basically the size of your car. If you go from images that could barely detect a runway on a little spit of land up in Siberia down to being able to tell between a truck or a car, that's pretty amazing. And this was only the first program. Reentry capsules had film. They had air water recovery. As I said before, the tracking stations would command the satellite as they're flying over, hey, pop your satellite or pop your reentry bucket out at a certain time. It would come in the atmosphere. It would pop a parachute, and then the recovery control group crews would try to grab it in the air. If it didn't grab it in the air, the capsule hit the water. It had a salt plug inside that would keep it afloat for 24 hours. After that, salt plug would dissolve and the capsule would sink to the bottom of the sea. I forgot how many actually failed to be picked up. But the success rate on the crews, either aerial or the water pickups, were really good. The film, after it was captured in Hawaii, was first taken to California, back to Lockheed, not for processing, but some of the payloads on board, the Agena, were electronic intelligence. Sorry, I should say signals intelligence. Aft rack. So the rear rack of the Agena, the aft rack, held an electronic payload package. When the first Discover 13 brought its payload back, it was supposed to be just an American flag in a bucket. It actually had a signals intelligence payload on that. So they dropped it off at Lockheed. Lockheed did their thing secretly and quietly. Then they transported it to the Hawkeye plant in New York, that Eastman Kodak. They developed the film until Westover Air Force Base had their film processing. There were similar mission profiles for KH-7 Gambit, KH-8 Gambit Cubed, and KH-9 Hexagon. I say that again, I'm doing a disservice. I'm trying to hit stuff quickly. Is that satellites launched, they flew over the targets, they were commanded to take pictures whenever, they would be loaded up into the bucket, and then when it flew over the Pacific, they'd be commanded to drop on recovery capsule, and they'd be captured by, at first, the C-119Js aircraft, and then later JT-130s. And all of them returned film in that manner. And all of those missions above were controlled by the stick and that worldwide ground network. Photo at the bottom, you should be able to recognize that. That's a Pentagon in DC. That was one of the later Corona photographs. And you can see the resolution. You can tell actually between each of the rings. And this was actually kind of watered down from what the NRO had to really say. I guarantee it's a little bit better than that. Please. And again, I'm going to do a disservice to these by not covering enough, but so even better pictures. I'm going to leave it at that. I have resolution ranges for these programs and some of the documentation, but since some of the film is still classified for a few of the missions, I'm just going to stay away from those. Even better. The Gambit, their Gambit KH-7, the first Gambits, were their missions lasted from days to weeks. and their resolution were started out similar to the mid-level Corona ones, and then got better. And the resolution was better than a foot. Verbatim quote from the Gambit history, so I'll leave it at that. The KH-7 had 38 flights, had one bucket, and used an Atlas Agena to get onto orbit. So again, Agena pops up. We hear, you know, it's lineage back to Sunnyvale and Lockheed. KH-8 and the Gambit Cube, 54 flights. Oh, this was an amazing satellite. A lot of its good imagery is still classified. 54 flights. That program ran from 1966 to 1984. I won't tell you how old I was in 1984, but the fact that film-based reconnaissance satellites were still being launched then, I think it's really cool. I wish I had known, but you know, those were launched by Titan Agenas. So the satellite is bigger, more capable, has 2 film recovery buckets, needs a larger booster to get it into orbit, still requires that Agena. And the KH-9 Hexagon. That's the picture up top there. Big bird. This was an amazing satellite. Had four recovery buckets, film buckets. It actually had a 5th one. If you see the tip of it on the left-hand side, the mapping system. So this had thousands of feet of film pictured over weeks to months in orbit. Some of the photos have been declassified. Oh, they were amazing. The swath width of that camera, Mr. Phil Pressel has done some great presentations on what Hexagon did, because he was like knee deep in Hexagon for his entire career. Swath width, I think, from either Cincinnati to Washington, D.C. I mean, the camera could just take, 300, 400 miles and take an image of that one shot. All these were controlled by the stick. As these missions increased in number and complexity, the folks at the, I'm still calling it the stick, but it was named other things then, they were getting to the point of being task saturated. Multiple missions on orbit, multiple types of missions. Missions were segregated, different complexes. Yeah, it was just getting to be a problem, and the Air Force kind of recognized that. And we'll go to the next slide. So in the end of the 60s, the DoD, actually mid 60s, the end of the 60s, the DoD liked what NASA was doing in launching men into orbit. Cool. We want to have a laboratory. We want to do DoD related, defense related research and stuff in orbit. So we're going to have a manned orbiting laboratory. Well, the deep dark secret there was that manned orbiting laboratory was basically a manned spy satellite. As you can see from that picture, it's the Gemini capsule up front. Gemini B holds 2 astronauts, and that laboratory in back was a giant camera mirror system that could be controlled by the astronauts. Used film-based, just like all the other technology at the time, but the astronauts would go in there, had this really cool little viewer, kind of like the folks in Star Trek, and they could guide the camera over areas and targets of interest. The problem with the film-based cameras is you had to tell it early where you wanted to photograph. And you didn't always get to tell what the weather was like or what was going on. Sometimes you got pictures of clouds, sometimes you got pictures of nothing. In the case of the MOL, or MOL, I've heard it both ways, the astronaut could say, oh, it's cloudy today, I'm not going to photograph that site. But there's another site over here I can take a picture of because there's no clouds. That was the Dorian, KH-10 Dorian payload. It was canceled in 1969 for 2 reasons that I've heard and that I've read in documentation. Vietnam War is going out of control, costs are skyrocketing. NASA's taking a good chunk of the budget for Apollo. Money being spent, people are wondering, why are we doing this? And this really interesting technology called electro-optical imaging, digital photography, was coming into being about that time. So realizing that this technology is going to be outdated and it was going to be cost overrun, a lot of other issues, it was canceled outright in July 1969. But the Air Force, in its forethought, 1968, bought some land, 8.2 acres, next to building 1001, the stick, and decided to build a 4-story ops building. Thought MOL was going to go off, thought we need to have a place where we can run all of these missions. The picture you see at the bottom there was a plan I got from an aerospace report from, I think, the early mid-1960s. And that hatched area at the bottom where it says operations building, that's the blue cube, the advanced stick. as they called it. And as you can see, the other 3 squares is they had planned for expansion. And there'd be even more missions that they would have to expand and control there. Next slide. There's some pictures in here of the construction of the Blue Cube. It's July 1968. It's truncated at the bottom there. You can kind of see where the four stories are being built. That gap in between, plenum flooring for data transmission and things. And you can see how close. I guess that would be Innovation Way right there. I don't know what it's named back in the day. I didn't find enough research on Sunnyvale back in the day what that street was called. But you can see the S curve and how close that building was. And to think if there was going to be expansion, I don't know where they would put the building. Next slide, please. All right, this one is in September. And you can see some of the concrete panels are being added to the building. So building this advanced stick at the time it was known, now it was known as building 1003, 258 feet by 143 feet, 100 foot tall. Those concrete panels were 3 inches thick. They were bolted to that steel frame by 4 angular bolts from each of the corners. They were designed to break away from the building in a magnitude 8.0 earthquake. When we get to the 1980s, we'll talk about a quake that happened that I could not find any information that any panels broke off, but the building itself suffered some damage. Slide, please. And this is at the end of the year, 5 months later, and you can see almost all the panels are on the building. And construction is almost complete. 1968, and the MOL was not canceled until July 1969. Next slide. An early 1970s photo. I can't date it exactly. I have to check on when some of the other buildings just sprouted up. So at this time, 1971, so it still was known as a satellite test annex. It didn't get known to be Sunnyvale Air Force Station until 1971. So this would have been about that time. Now, people still call the building and the operations there the Satellite Test Center, or the Air Force. In their documentation and their history here, it said the only time the stick was a correct designation was from December 1959 to July 1960. So 7 months. And then it was renamed all those multiple times. A little confusing because into the 70s, you see Satellite Test Center in big 3-foot letters on the building. The Air Force actually took this down not too long after to basically disassociate who was working there and what they were doing. It's really kind of hard to hide a big blue cube-shaped building, especially with nothing around in the background. Next slide, please. All right. I'll go back to my caveats from the beginning of the briefing. I am not associated with any of these 3-letter agencies. That diagram was declassified a handful of months ago. Find it on the NRO website with some of their histories of the electro-optical system, all of its caveats and code names, which would end up being what's called Canon. The development of Canon and the digital imagery was based on the fact that film-based satellite systems were too slow. Too many world crises were happening before they could actually launch a satellite, take the pictures, get it back, and get it developed. The early missions were a couple of days. The later ones with the Gambit or the Hexagon took days to weeks to months to drop these buckets. And by then, the crisis may have been resolved. Cuban Missile Crisis, good example, 6-day war, and the invasion of Czechoslovakia. All of these happened in short amount of time that they got imagery of it. You didn't see it until weeks or months later. It's actually no good for a crisis. That electro-optical technology could be downloaded to a ground station in near real time. So this image right here shows that satellite, you can see it close to the Earth, wired some way to relay data back to Earth. And those were those relay satellites and those really weird orbits. Now, the reason I put this in here is the change from film-based satellites to the electro-optical but also the fact is, up until that point, almost every mission that the Air Force or the NRO had run was based out at the stick, commanding, controlling, planning, all that. This was the first system to have its own dedicated ground station. I'm going to say this for the recording. There is a memo in the CIA FOIA database that mentions a ground station. They talk about congressmen and women visiting the ground station. So they meet at the Capitol and they would drive somewhere an hour away. So that's why I put the words DC area. I'm going to leave it at that. Because of the change in technology and the sort of revolution there, I don't have much information that's been declassified to talk about what the effect was on Sunnyvale Air Force Station and what it was now at that time being known as the Air Force Satellite Control. So Blue Cube, Air Force Satellite Control Facility from 1977 to mid 80s. Again, another name change, but if we're talking about that place, and you stick with me here, then we're good. So upgrades that happened to Sunnyvale Air Force Station and the satellite control facility was building these large terminals, these large dishes. Anyone who saw the Blue Cube before it was demolished, these things stick out in your mind. I got some great photos back in the 80s and early 90s of the dishes. Sun East and Sun West, heavy terminals. They were dedicated comms to geosync spacecraft, geosynchronous orbit, and they had a lot of missions that they covered. This allowed connectivity of the building, not only through the worldwide control network it was already running, but it could beam and receive from these other comm satellites. I just put the statement there, data monetization. I showed in the previous slide of digital imagery. It's going to take a lot of bandwidth, a lot of bits to send the pictures down or around or wherever you want it to go. And that wasn't the only mission that required more digital bandwidth. The 70s was like the golden era of space, I guess, for the military side. There was a lot of cool missions upcoming with the space shuttle and all that. So they wanted to modernize the infrastructure as early as they could. More operations on orbit, more bandwidth required. I put a couple of the missions down there. Discus, Defense Satellite Communication System, NATO Skynet. These were used by our allied partners, but they used similar satellite buses to what we had already used, and the expertise was there at Sunnyvale. Navstar GPS, positioning, navigation, and timing. I know that from the research I've been doing. And DMSP, the weather satellites. These are only naming a few missions that were controlled by or data flowed through the Blue Cube. Next slide, please. Shuttle era. So, end of the Apollo era, NASA's featuring budget cuts. They're like, what is our next step? President Nixon gets the Space Task Group together and say, we need to find a way to maximize space for Earth. So they developed the space truck, the space shuttle. NASA does not have money to do this. The Department of Defense / NRO does. So they agreed to help support and fund the shuttle. There were some capabilities that they demanded NASA put into the shuttle. One of them was the dimensions of the cargo bay. I don't have the dimensions of the shuttle cargo bay, but I know that it was 60 foot long and I think 15 feet wide, roughly. Someone's going to nail me on specifics there. But they wanted to launch a hexagon-sized payload. That hexagon film-based satellite was the size of a Greyhound bus, and they wanted the shuttle launch that. Plans NASA had before the space shuttle, it didn't look like anything we know and see today, like in that image. It was a lot smaller, supposed to go up quickly, drop the payload off, grab the payload, come back down. NRO said, if you're going to take our money, you're going to put these specifications down. Air Force Satellite Control Facility, Blue Cube provided ops and comm support during the entire shuttle program from 1981 to 2010. They were there every step of the way. Everyone talks about NASA, Johnson Space Center, the Cape Canaveral. The Blue Cube was there every step of the way. There is, I got to show you this. To another author, Roland Black, Into the Black, talks about the first space shuttle mission, Columbia. And there's a lot of pages in here that mention the Blue Cube and their operators. Leave it at that. One of the things Johnson Space Center had to do was if they wanted to launch a classified payload or talk to the astronauts dealing with those payloads, they had to put their control center in what's called controlled mode. Kick out the people who don't need to hear, go encrypted, that kind of thing, talk to the shuttle astronauts, and then get everyone back. Very cumbersome. So the Air Force wanted to find a better way. Slide, please. The reason they wanted to find a better way was 1982, President Reagan wrote NSDD, National Security Decision Directive 8, which said the Space Transportation System, Shuttle, is the launch platform for the United States. Civil, military, national. Everything had to go on the shuttle, unless there was a really good reason why it couldn't. The first two orbiters, Challenger and Columbia and Challenger, they were heavy. They had extra instrumentation payload inside. They were heavy spacecraft. OV-103, Discovery, was built 6,000 pounds lighter because the plans from the NRO and the Air Force were to launch from California. The only one thing you're going to do in California, well, two things. You're going to launch payloads into polar orbits, which were similar to Corona, Gambit, and Hexagon, and other satellites, or you're going to launch missiles. As you can see right there, the Air Force had modified what was called Space Launch Complex 6, SLIC 6, to launch the shuttle. It had to be lighter because they wanted to put heavy payloads inside and use the solid rocket boosters with augmented thrust to launch hexagon-sized payloads. West Coast Shuttle Facility at Vandenberg also had a runway, payload processing, solid rocket booster, and external tank processing. It was basically everything you know and love out at Cape Canaveral, out in California. The first launch at SLIC 6 was expected in late 1986, and the crew included the director of the NRO, Pete Aldrich. The NRO was not declassified at the time, so he was the undersecretary for something. But as you go through the history and you're like, the director of the NRO is going to fly on a bird flying out of Vandenberg. Interesting. Please. Now, that task saturation I talked about at Sunnyvale, at Air Force Satellite Control Facility, the Air Force realized we're reaching maximum capacity of what we can do. We got to find a better way to do this. If we're adding the shuttle and these other payloads on board, we're going to be tapped out. So, end of the 70s, early 1980s, there was a push to operationalize space. Remember I told the Air Research Development Command, Air Force Systems Command, all this stuff was seen as test. Satellites are not full up, they're testing, they're in testing. Well, this operationalization of space was, it's actually a warfighter asset to put it out there. 1982, the Air Force stands up Space Command, dedicated command to operationalizing space. With the additions of the shuttle and the processing out at Vandenberg and more satellite missions, Discus, GPS, and a few others, they needed a dedicated ground station that could pick up the slack. The Consolidated Operations Center, CSOC, built out in the plains of Colorado Springs, then became known as Falcon Air Force Station. CSOC consisted of two parts, Satellite Operations Center and the Shuttle Operations and Planning Center. One side of CSOC would deal with flying satellites. The other side would deal with shuttle operations. It was basically the Blue Cube and Johnson Space Center combined. It could control the satellites and the payloads. It could it could guide and monitor the shuttle missions. And it would have its own link to that worldwide satellite control network through its own tracking station on site. That's one thing that Onizuka did not have, or Sunnyvale did not have at the time, was a dedicated ground terminal. It reached out to the worldwide network. It wasn't until much later that they had that ground terminal there. But CSOC planned ahead and said, we're going to have it on track. It was later renamed Triever Air Force Base after General Triever, talked about earlier, in 2000. And it went IOC in 1985. So Shuttle is supposed to launch military missions from Vandenberg in 86. Falcon goes online early initial capability in 85. Next slide. Then Challenger happens. So I am pretty sure everyone on the line here knows where they were when Challenger exploded. 25th Space Shuttle mission had a 7-person crew. From that crew, we had 4 shuttle veterans. 4 people had already launched into space at least once. The teacher in space, Christopher McAuliffe off the left-hand side, and payload specialist, Gregory Jarvis, standing right behind Krista. And then off to the right-hand side, we see Lieutenant Colonel Ellison Onizuka. The payloads on board Challenger, there were many reasons why it was rushed. I'm not going to go into it here. There's videos, there's books, there's all sorts of things about why Challenger happened. That spacecraft, aside from teaching space, carried a tracking data relay satellite for NASA. First one that was launched in 1983, went into the wrong orbit. So they really needed to replace it so it could actually fulfill that network. Data transfer and keeps coming back, you know. And if you look on the patch on the bottom, at the top part of the blue and white star field, you see what looks like a comet. Challenger carried a payload to study Halley's Comet. It was coming close to Earth in 1986. Challenger was destroyed 73 seconds after launch, and there were no survivors. It's a second fatal accident. So we are introduced to Colonel Onizuka. Colonel Onizuka, first Japanese American in space, part of the Group 8 TFNGs. Anyone who's been in the military could recognize what that acronym is, but for a polite audience, it stands for the 35 new guys. But TFNGs included women for the first time in the astronaut corps, minorities, hope I don't offend anyone with that, Japanese Americans, African Americans. It was a diverse set of the American population. First NASA group to include that. Colonel Onizuka was born in Kona, Hawaii. He got his degrees from the University of Colorado at Boulder. He became a test pilot throughout the early part of his career and then joined NASA in 1978. He was selected for STS-51C, launched January 1985. This was the shortest mission in the entire program, all the way up to 2010. It lasted 3 days. The gentleman underneath was the crew, or the crew of STS-51C. Notice something? They're all wearing military uniforms. STS-51C was presumably a mission. No details have been declassified about that flight, and we'll talk about it here. I will say this: Colonel Onizuka did the payload, whatever they launched, used an IUS, an inertial upper stage. So Colonel Onizuka was the subject matter expert of the IUS when that payload was. After the mission, success, great, wonderful things, he gets promoted to lieutenant colonel. At the time, he was married with 2 daughters. Time of the accident that we talked about. Next slide, please. Okay, so 1986 was a bad year for the space program. Challenger blows up in January. In April, the last Hexagon mission is on a Titan rocket out of Vandenberg. It launches and it goes up in a huge explosion. There's a picture of it right before it just completely. 1986, I'm sorry, May 1986, a GOES-G, that's a weather satellite for NASA, goes up in flames off a Delta rocket. There's a lot of problems going on in the space program, and folks are just wondering what the heck is going on. So the Air Force goes back and has to reanalyze. Do we really want this blue shuttle thing? So Slick 6, the launch site at Vandenberg, is put in minimum caretaker status. NRO satellites are pushed back onto expendable rockets. They're like, the shuttle is too risky to launch these things. There's a 32-month hiatus for the shuttle. And the Falcon Air Force Station, CSOC, starts ramping up. So the SOPSI, the Shuttle Operations Planning Center, was canceled. Air Force not using the shuttle anymore, canceled that part of it, the SOC, Satellite Operations Center. It's basically what Triefer took and grew over the decades. Next slide. All right, the blue cube in the 1980s. Go through a couple more name changes here. So the Sunnyvale Air Force Station is named after Colonel Onizuka in July 1986. So it is Onizuka Air Force Station. In 1989, we have the National Reconnaissance Program, the NRP. A lot of the history stuff that I've been using, collecting and all that, those kind of barked after about the mid-1980s. A lot of payloads that are being launched or controlled. I have supposition, I have guesses, but I have nothing in black and white off these declassified documents. Very few operational details are released. So that's where part of my presentation for here on out, I'm not going to guess or say what things are. I'd love to read that history when it gets printed. As I said before, the Blue Cube supported shuttle missions from the beginning to the end. 17 October 1989, long before we had a quake. I was here in New Mexico enjoying the World Series. We're going to work until the World Series, and the earthquake struck at 5:04 p.m. There was a mission to launch a probe to Jupiter on Atlantis the next day. The shuttle was going to go up. This probe, Galileo, had waited years to be launched. It kept being pushed back, the Challenger accident, all sorts of scheduling problems. It finally gets the chance to be launched, and they need support from the Blue Cube. Earthquake happens. I got some apocryphal stories here. There's not a lot of documentation that I can find, but the apocryphal, talking to people, and a couple NASA histories, is the people at Onizuka wanted to go in and make sure that shuttle mission was not canceled. They wanted to go do their support. So hours after the quake, they go into their building and they do their operations. It was very risky because, as you guys know, more so in California than I do here, aftershocks. The damage to the building was not quite determined. See that picture up there? Some offices were tossed. I got some better ones where paper actually tipped over. I mean, heavy stuff all over the place. They went in, they got the mission done. Atlantis launched, Galileo launched, and it was a great story after that. However, after they did the research about the analysis of the building, there were a lot of problems with the foundation. You can see that steel beam right there, cracked. Only one photo. They found lots. I don't know if the panels dropped off. As I said, I didn't get any clarification. The panels did drop off, but I know the building inside was wrecked. So a lot of these missions are transitioning to Falcon Air Force Station. Just to hang on a sec, drink of water. Things are transitioning to Falcon to use that operational satellite operations complex. The Blue Cube is then renamed yet again to the Consolidated Space Test Center. It goes from Air Force Systems Command to Air Force Space Command. They are now back to the future, to that satellite test center type thing, testing, research and development. And now they're the Consolidated Space Test Center for DoD. And this is before they transition to Air Force Space. Next slide, please. I'm not going to say anything about this slide. There are folks that like to do patchology. They like to look at them and determine what satellite missions they could be representing. I found a few of these online. I know they were at Onizuka. No, I'll leave it at that. Next slide, please. Where I said I wasn't not going to give every mission of Onizuka coverage, and like I said, I feel bad. These were 3 areas that worked at Onizuka up until the time of either closure or transition to Falcon, later Tree Air Force Base. I didn't want to go into too much detail about these because most of these, actually all of them, most of them are still operational. There's still stuff going on under the banners of these organizations. But what I can say was 21 stops. There were a few base realignment closure missions to try to, they realized Onizuka could not be upgraded. There were a lot of problems with doing data modernization. It's going to cost a lot of money. Space-wise, it's kind of limited in that area of Lockheed. So they recommended closure of a couple of the organizations, and 21 Stops became the host organization of Onizuka. It still ran that worldwide satellite control network, so still in charge of that. It did scheduling and connectivity to all the satellite missions. And if you think about the satellite missions from the 60s and the 70s, we get into the 80s and 90s, and that amount of traffic just keeps going up. So they're busy. And that Falcon Air Force Station took over some of the scheduling as a backup node while Onizuka was still primary. The patch in the middle, the 5th Space Operations Squadron. This was a unit that did launch and early orbit checkout of spacecraft. You get it off the shuttle, you get it off the booster, and they're going to make sure care and feeding is okay before the satellite goes on and does its mission. And it's handed off to the satellite operators or drivers out of Falcon. Really cool thing about 5 Stops, they also got to control the inertial upper stage. That upper stage that was used by Colonel Onizuka back in 51 Charlie and many NASA missions, other missions, the IUS. awesome booster. I mean, it puts Agena to shame, but you know, it also did second gen. Five Stops did some great work. There is a picture of the STS-93, Colonel Eileen Collins. They released the Chandra X-ray telescope. They had this huge banner in orbit that says, "Thank you, Onizuka Air Station, Five Stops." Name all the folks who worked on it. It's really cool. The last logo on the right-hand side, the Space Test Program. Back when the stick was still doing research and development, along with the National Reconnaissance Program satellites, anything the DoD could put into orbit to test and try new technologies was under the DoD Space Test Program. I actually moved off to Kirtland Air Force Base, near where I work. These were the other missions that, like I said, they're still doing stuff today, and I don't want to go into too much detail. Next slide. I briefly touched on this. Base Realignment and Closure Commission comes up with 1995 says we need to realign. Realize that Onizuka is vulnerable to sabotage. If you see that, you guys know the how's it 237, Matilda Aviation, and then the roads. You could sit there with a rocket-propelled grenade or something and fire it right over the fence and hit either one of the terminals or the building. So terrorism was high in the minds of force protection there. Earthquakes, you have 3 fault lines going under that area. In 1989, the Loma Prieta proved kind of what folks had thought about earlier and why they moved that Falcon out to the middle of nowhere on the Colorado Plains. And then what happened, and earthquakes, they did not know when the next one was going to strike. The expense to upgrade. The building was landlocked with what it had. It had 1960s/70s era technology. It was going to be very expensive to upgrade. And like I said, no room to grow. Can't make it any bigger without pushing stuff out to the side. 1995, they recommended realignment. Units were closed. Units were moved to other bases. Then by 2005, got to the point of they needed to close it. They had a plan to have a primary node of the scheduling, the control network out at Schriever at the time. They renamed it. And then they needed a backup, and then they had plans to make a backup. Onizuka had outlived its usefulness. I really hate to say that in those words, and transitioned to other sites. And that bottom bullet, some of the other missions went to other locations. But I received this from somebody a few years ago. I find it funny with the name National Reconnaissance Office Operating Facility. That is like the most generic name you can come up with. Really surprised because they like to name their programs and places. So just odd. All those patches I showed you before didn't say a thing about it. This program. Talked about the inactivation of those. They were not squadrons. I don't know if they were divisions or offices, but it just shows that they closed early 2000s where they could transition elsewhere, and then ones were closed right up until the NRO departed. So there was a ceremony March 7th, 2007, and the presiding official was the director of the NRO. Now, whenever a director of the NRO shows up anywhere, that's a big deal. So the fact that Dr. Kerr showed up, big deal. Awesome deal. Have no pictures, haven't had anything released. So again, love to know more. And I don't know what they were flying at the time, and I don't know the date time of the last commands. Again, with the beeps and squeaks, love to hear that stuff. I like this picture. I think it's an awesome picture. I think it kind of encompasses a bit of sadness there with the building and the dish. It's just amazing. Gotta thank the photographer who took that photo. 28 July 2010, 50th Space Wing Commander, Colonel Monteith. 21 stops had fallen under the 50th Space Wing. So he would be the presiding official for all the folks there, the units. He delivers a speech, and it's the official closure of Onizuka Air Force Station. Miss Lorna Onizuka, Colonel Onizuka's widow, did also speak, and so did the mayor of Sunnyvale. They didn't catch her name, but there were some great photos of everyone kind of shaking hands, and it was a sad day for all. It was a sad day until, next slide, please. At Vandenberg, 2 days later, they inaugurated the opening of the Ellison Onizuka Satellite Ops Facility. Kept the name, kept 21 stops and all that expertise in California. Moved 21 stops from the Bay Area down to Central Coast. I actually met a few alumni from Onizuka there. I was surprised. My second tour at Vandenberg in 2013 to 2015, got to meet a couple of folks, and I'm like, oh, wow, you were there. Amazing stuff. I'm sure they have great stories to tell. Again, love to hear them. when the base was renamed, when the Sunnyvale base was renamed for Colonel Onizuka, the Onizuka family donated a lot of his personal, say, artifacts, accoutrements, decorations, pictures, patches, a lot of stuff. And I'm glad to see that the Air Force moved that stuff down to the new facility. I have not been in that facility. I'd love to go. Hint, hint, if anyone's out there. But I'd love to see all the cool stuff inside. That's just, it's space history in there in the entryway. Next slide, please. Demolition of the Blue Cube in April 2014. I was surprised, very surprised. I read an article in the San Jose Mercury News. I forgot the journalist's name, but he talked about the demolition had begun in the late evening, early morning hours. There was no warning. I guess folks were outside the fence line taking pictures weeks up to, and they didn't know when it was going to happen, and then it happened. Yeah, I'd love to talk to the construction crew and ask why, but I don't know. But this would be, I guess, the first time since we saw those pictures in 1968 that you actually see inside the structure of the building. Plenum flooring, the 4 stories, and that, I would have to say maybe a fifth of the building is still left standing. When I worked on the project, I had a few folks who, I don't think they were associated with the Air Force, they may have been retired Lockheed employees. They provided some great photos since they were there on site as a demolition. So I'm very grateful to them. Next slide, please. So all you folks know from being in Silicon Valley that land is expensive. When Onizuka, when it was knocked down or was going to be realigned, shut down, demolished, people wondered what was going to happen to that land. I read stuff that there was going to be, I don't know if it wasn't a homeless camp, homeless shelter, a car dealership. I know some folks tried, I think it was Sunnyvale Historical Society tried to get it saved as a museum. What ended up happening was 9.15 acres was given to Foothill College. They built the Sunnyvale campus, Sunnyvale Center. Slides mistitled there. It's very cool. I went there in 2016. It's a blue cube-shaped building. And inside there are a lot of memorials dedicated to the folks out at Onizuka, the Challenger crew, Colonel Onizuka himself, and their mascot is the owls. And as you can see that picture on there, and while I was there, I got this nice big cup. I don't know if they sell them anymore. my prize coffee. So actually, can you back one? If you get a chance, if you guys are in that area neck of the woods, you can get in the building. That mural is in one of the hallways, one of the staircase hallways. A lot of signatures and a lot of dates when people were there. There were a few stretching all the way back to like 1961. I have zoom-ins on other photos, and I was just surprised at the pride that all the workers had. They wanted to sign that. So this last slide, I took the image from the NRO's recent brochure, 2020, and I just put down the locations. So when you talk about one place, Sunnyvale / Onizuka, and all the work that was accomplished there, the people, the missions, all of that, it had to be split into multiple locations around the US, in some cases the world. I have met people at most of these locations. I have met Onizuka alumni, and it's amazing to hear the fond stories they have of being in the Bay Area, even if it was only for a few years. I'll actually read one of my bullets here. Onizuka's workforce is spread far and wide, carrying their knowledge and experience, and more importantly, their stories. And I really, honestly, truly would love to hear them all. Here is the project. Had a lot of hesitation at first. Had a lot of hesitation at first when I tried to get the editors to work on this. Is they're like, we don't really care about a Japanese Air Force base. Why are you proposing this? And I had to reorient them to how important the base was, who Colonel Onizuka was, and the linkage to Challenger. And just, I told them, I was like, out of all of my books, this one will sell the best. It has been true thus far. 100% of the royalties are being donated to the Sunnyvale Historical Society. When I spoke to Laura Babcock, she talked about having a blue cube exhibit back in a few years ago. They finally got permission to wreck down a couple of their trees in the yard there to build that exhibit. I'm honored and flattered that they allowed me to be part of that in some small way. It runs the gamut, kind of like this presentation does. Talk about as much as I could. What was declassified at the time? So you actually got a couple more details here in this presentation. And there have been additional declassifications in 2019. More signals intelligence satellites. Lots of cool beeps and squeaks on that one. Electro-optical imaging was this year, and then who knows what's going to be declassified in the future. When I put down future projects, I have projects in the works. I won't mention any here, but if any of the Onizuka alum want to do their projects, I know I've kind of exchanged details with one or two folks. I can offer you the process I've gone through. It may work for you, it may not. I don't know, but I can at least offer some advice if you want to know to get the way out there. Next slide, please. So here's my email address up at the top there. If you'd like to talk or email and you think it may delve into some areas, there is a NRO review and redaction guide for those particular missions. What has been declassified, what they allow out there, and the details here. And I highly encourage people to read it before they come talk. Do not want to broach that getting information from multiple sources and get into it. All of my books and articles have gone through security and policy release at the Pentagon. So if you read or hear the way I presented stuff or saw the slides, and you're like, that's kind of weird. Why would you say that? There's a reason I'm saying it that way. And if you're bored, well, no, the pandemic had a lot of time to read, do nothing but stay at home. Plenty of declassified material on the NRO's website. Yeah, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of pages. When I do FOIA requests for documents that are 1.5 inches thick, usually they update them once a quarter. Sometimes they're a little slow on that, but whatever I request will usually be posted to the website a couple weeks or months later. So everyone can read, so I don't have to go to a photocopier and photocopy stuff for people. It's all digital and you can read it. And thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope I didn't mess up too many of the details, but again, I had to truncate some of it for security reasons. Are there any questions?
Yeah, Joe. Hi, Joe.
Hi.
Paul. So that was very good. I worked at the STC for 3 years, from 63 to 66.
Very cool.
And it was interesting, some of the stuff you brought up and some of the stuff I know too, but I appreciate the effort you did.
Thank you. If I can bring up the chat there.
I'm trying to read the chat questions. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Annette.
Thank you. You had several that were very complimentary. One was from Jim Schnepp, who said his name is on the owl mural.
Very cool.
Are there any other questions for chat, please?
Yeah, I had one question. Just if you happen to know, in the case of the satellites that dropped the film off, were they purposely deorbited when they were out of film, or were they left to just decay, or are they still floating around up there?
So it depends. Okay, so they were the early missions. They didn't use the entire film roll. They deorbited as quick as possible because they wanted to do research and development testing. Test the first couple birds, make sure they actually work, bring them back in. If the film bucket was or the film roll was complete, they bring it back. There were a few missions. I'm trying to think of one. There's one specific mission. It was a Gambit mission, and it is declassified, so it is on the website. Something happened where the buckets were actually fired up instead of down. So they remained in orbit for decades. I was in the Air Force early 2000s when this was kind of a problem, not a problem, but people didn't, think to track this. Hey, there's still a film bucket that's in orbit for how many decades later? But it re-entered. That's the only one I can think of where it was fired in the wrong direction and stayed in orbit. Everything else, they wanted to bring back as soon as possible. there was a 1965 mission, if I remember correctly, where the satellite re-entered or launched. It ended up in Venezuela. So the rocket pieces, film, and all that stuff ended up in Venezuela, and the Air Force is kind of embarrassed because they're like, oh, hey, that doesn't belong to us, not the Americans. And it says property of the US government stamped on the side of it. So in most cases, they wanted to deorbit those as quick as possible. So there was nothing left either in orbit or to fall over somebody else's territory.
Here's another question from Mike. You mentioned that there was a manned program using Gemini. Was this actually done, or was it just a plan that didn't happen?
It was a plan that didn't happen, but it wasn't just a plan. They built hardware. They had 3 astronaut groups, MOL or MOL Group 1, 2, and 3. They were in training when the program was canceled. I mean, it surprised everyone, from the manufacturer to the astronauts, everyone, that MOL was canceled. A couple of the astronauts who were young enough were actually brought over to NASA to be shuttle pilots. Dick Truly, Bob Crippen. Those are the 2 I can think of right now. I'm sure there were a few more. Don Peterson, he was on the Teacher's mission, the first one. They were young enough to meet NASA's specifications to go over. Everyone else was kind of, they said too old, so they went back to other Air Force missions. But MOL was never launched. There was a boilerplate test in 1966 of a rocket that would have weighed what it would have to see if the Titan would actually work. But that was it. There's a lot of hardware that was developed before they canceled it.
Thank you.
Actually, you want to follow up? Can I follow up that real quick? If you ever get out to the National Museum of the Air Force in Dayton, they have a Gemini E capsule sitting there specifically for that MOL program.
Are there any more questions, please?
Yeah, can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes.
Joe, I was a captain at the Blue Cube for 4 years in the 70s, and I just want to tell everyone that the Hexagon satellite is at the Wright-Patterson Air Museum as well as Gambit. So if people want to see what they really look like, you can go out there. It's quite a display. The Hexagon was an engineering model that could have flown, but typically when there's on-orbit problems, they would look at the satellite that was built identical to the one on orbit to look at corrective action.
Very cool. I have been out there for work out to Dayton a few times, and I've taken probably 1,000 photos of both satellites at every inch of it, the Agena, the film buckets, everything. And what's disappointing is that those are there, and I have taken a photo of the last remaining Corona, which is in Washington, D.C., National Air and Space Museum. So, I mean, having to go to 2 separate places to see all that history is disappointing, but it's awesome to have all of that right there in Dayton.
Yeah, and for the gentleman that was asking about the what happens to the satellite when all the buckets are done, yes, we would burn them in over the Pacific, and we had 4 film buckets, and you're right, they would sit up there waiting to come down. It could be a month or 2 on about a 7-month mission, the ones I was involved in. And so it was, you know, you had to wait and wait and wait. So the optical was a lot better, and it's quite an interesting story. And thank you very much. Over.
I was about to say that too.
Here is a comment. Since I was 10 and Sputnik was launched, I've been a space geek. I lived within a few miles of the stick/Blue Cube for more than 40 years. First time I knew what it did. Thank you so very much for the program and your detailed research and book.
So I will answer this one, even though it's a comment. You're welcome. That's the kind of, that's the audience I was aiming for. The children, spouses, everyone who did not know what went on in that building, as much as I could cover it here. I know I love talking to the guys who actually work in the building, but it's the ones going, what did that building do for all this time? I mean, you get bits and pieces in the news and other places, but giving that comprehensive view going, wow, that was a center of command and control for decades, the US military and the National Reconnaissance Program. I didn't know, I just drove past it every day. So thank you for the comment.
So are there any more questions? The chat is still open.
Well, I raised my hand, so I'll ask a question.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'm curious about the early. Oh God, Let the other guy ask his question first. I've forgotten what I was going to ask.
I had a question. Did you come across information about the blue cube being on the target list for our adversaries as far as during the Cold War?
I did not. So it's not for lack of trying. Normally anything dealing with force protection or threats from the Soviets come from Air Force OSI, Office of Special Investigations. Even stuff that is decades old on a building that no longer exists, they did not want to provide anything through a FOIA request. Now I guarantee, I would stake my life on this, that it was high on that list. As a Minuteman III crew member, I was privy to some of the lists of what we would fire back. And I could tell you similar facilities would have been on that list. So I guarantee it was giant bullseye, especially being the single point of failure at the time until Falcon stood up. Over.
Annette, will this recording be available on YouTube?
Yes, it will. In fact, this is going to be posted in about 1 week on www.saratogahistory.com, which will take you to YouTube.
And I will stand by afterwards for people to nitpick the presentation. So please give me any comments or feedback later on. I'm open to that. I'm humble enough to know I did mess some things up. So feel free to email me.
I finally remembered my question. It was about the very early space age when the first Sputnik was launched. My understanding is, I forget where I read this, that the US could have been the first to launch, but Eisenhower deliberately wanted the Soviet Union to launch first to provide precedence.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. He did not want, okay, so if anyone, you know about orbital mechanics, you can't really control where the satellite stays unless it's in geosynchronous orbit. So anything that's flying in low Earth orbit is going to cover a lot of land mass. So Eisenhower was worried that if we launched first, they would say, oh, we're going to do protected airspace all the way into space that you can't fly over. So Eisenhower wanted a legal precedent to say, oh, let the Russians do it first. They're not going to be able to control where Sputnik goes. That, oh, hey, they did it first and freedom of flight and all that, then we can do it with impunity afterwards. So yes, I don't have any of my documentation here, but yes, absolutely correct.
Thanks.
Here's a comment from Chuck. There was a lot of misinformation spread regarding the purpose of the blue cube. I heard it was a command/control for submarines.
I don't know the entire history. I will say that there are parts unknown. I had not heard of that. I would have to probably spend some more time researching it, but during my time as the Minuteman crew member, I learned about ELF and how they communicate to submarines, emergency action messages, and Blue Cube did not come up on any of those sites. Over.
How does that do that?
Do I see any more questions? Did we lose Joe?
No, I'm still here. I was
Okay.
through the text chat too, but I didn't see anything else.
Okay. Well, I think we're gonna end today's presentation. I can't thank you enough, Joe, because it was really very, very interesting and I learned a lot. And judging from the comments from the audience, they did too. As I mentioned, we are going to put the recorded version of this on our website at www.saratogahistory.com. Give us a few days. It won't happen immediately because we're all volunteer. But I know that people will enjoy hearing it again. So I want to thank you very much, as well as our audience, for listening in. And it was just really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you again for inviting me. And again, if you have my email address, feel free to email me and if you just want to chat. Thank you again,
Thank
Annette, and thank you everyone for showing up.